I've reviewed over 270 PC monitors, and this one has really got my head scratching. It's called the Samsung Odyssey OLED G8, or the G80SD with its product name, which sports a flat 31.5-inch matte-coated QD-OLED panel with a refresh rate of 240Hz and a resolution of 4K. It also has adaptive sync support such as Nvidia G-Sync and AMD FreeSync, and also HDR. Now, at the time of filming, and in the UK, it can be found for £820, while in the US it can be found for $1,100. Now, in this review, I'll be seeing if it's actually worth its price tag and how it compares to some of its key competitors. But before doing so, I would just like to thank MSI for actually sponsoring this video. More on them a little bit later. Now, to kick things off, I would just like to get something off my chest. And for you to achieve the maximum refresh rate of 240Hz, you have to oddly enable game mode, which locks a lot of other settings and takes away from the overall color accuracy of the panel. Yes, indeed, I have no idea why Samsung have decided to do this, and don't ask me either, because I have absolutely no idea. If you were to disable game mode, you'll be limited up to 120Hz. Now, thankfully, however, you have got two full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports and a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input, all of which will give you the maximum refresh rate and resolution of the monitor, of course, if you have enabled game mode. Now, with that in mind, I would also like to highlight that with game mode disabled, I found that the input lag was subjectively quite high, and therefore I certainly had to have game mode enabled in order for me to get the lowest input lag. Here, it is also worth considering that if you have VRR control enabled, it will significantly increase the overall input lag. And yes, this is something that you might want to enable in certain conditions, but given the overall input lag that you're going to be attaining, then you'll probably want to have this disabled. I'll be touching upon the VRR control in just a little bit. Now, in terms of the input lag with game mode enabled and the VRR control disabled, it was actually stonkingly good. I had absolutely no problems when it came to registering my mouse inputs in a hardcore competitive shooter such as Valorant and Counter-Strike 2. Now, similarly, the monitor's response time is excellent. Given the fact it has got a QD-OLED panel, it should come as almost no surprise. And indeed, over here, using the OSRTD tool to give me an objective number, the average initial time, which translates to the average G to G, which most manufacturers claim, sits at 1.08, with the percent in window at a perfect 100%. So yes, indeed, it is really hitting that 240Hz refresh rate window, and it has no problems whatsoever when it comes to replicating that image. Similarly, the overall visual experience is excellent, and this is of course thanks to the fact that you have got that OLED panel. This means that you've got no sort of inverse ghosting or overshoot to worry about, which is something that plagues LCD panels, in other words, IPS VAs and TNs. As you'll be able to see here from the UFO ghosting test, there is no sort of extra trail behind the UFOs. In terms of the overall motion clarity, it is pretty good. Again, this is the fact that it has got 240Hz refresh rate and therefore makes everything look a little bit more fluid, and indeed in comparison to 120Hz just looks all that bit more clear. Although it's worth mentioning over here that this monitor, unlike certain OLEDs out there on the market, albeit a little bit rare, do not have any sort of motion blur reduction technology, or MBR. So therefore, it's just something worth contemplating. If you're a hardcore competitive gamer, there's maybe something that you might want to look for. Now, I don't anticipate a lot of people getting this monitor playing hardcore competitive games because of its 31.5-inch form factor and 4K resolution. Nonetheless, it is still actually very much tuned for hardcore gamers out there. But what about when it comes to more casual gaming, or indeed graphically intense games? Well, in this case, this brings me on to adaptive sync technologies. In other words, AMD FreeSync and Nvidia G-Sync. Now, as I've got an RTX 3080, I can test the latter, and when connected over DisplayPort to my desktop computer, I had no sort of black screen issues while running the Nvidia Pendulum demo with Nvidia G-Sync enabled at 4K. Now, yes, indeed, this monitor has also got G-Sync compatibility. There's a small little sticker, in fact, on the stand, which is also a little bit triggering for my OCD because it's slightly off-center, but that's a small little moot point. When it comes to actually using the monitor, there is, of course, a little bit of VRR flicker. I say of course because it's very much present on every single OLED monitor out there. Now, in order to counteract this, Samsung have included VRR control, which you can enable via the monitor's OSD. Now, this indeed does give you less flicker and pretty much completely eliminates it. However, do bear in mind what I did mention before, in that it does and to the overall input lag of the monitor. As a result, when it came to using it myself, I actually sided towards having a little bit of VR flicker, which is pretty much not really noticeable in a real-world gaming scenario, other than, for example, in a static scene, and therefore meant that I was able to get lower input lag and therefore a better gaming experience. Better still, I was able to run Nvidia G-Sync at 4K at 240Hz with HDR. Now yes, indeed, all these technologies worked in tandem and had no sort of problems. However, the overall HDR experience, in my opinion, was a little bit subdued, which I do think is due to the fact that you have got that matte coating to it. See, while comparing and contrasting it with some glossy or indeed semi-glossy panels out there, namely when it comes to OLEDs, I just didn't feel that it really popped in terms of the image. Now there's a bunch of settings that I potentially could have gotten wrong, but having played around with it and gone back and forth with different HDR settings, nothing really seemed to impact the overall HDR experience, and it just felt that it was a little bit more subdued and somewhat washed out. That's the best way I can describe it. Nonetheless, the HDR experience itself is still absolutely sublime, so don't get that mistaken. The fact that the monitor can get to roughly 1000 nits in terms of peak brightness and does really well when it comes to OLED technology, therefore bettering the likes of regular LCD panels. But again, when comparing and contrasting it with some of its nearest competitors, it just didn't really seem to tick that box. This brings me on to today's sponsor, MSI. The manufacturer has a unique gaming monitor, the MPG272URX, which sports a flat 26.5-inch 4K 240Hz QD-OLED panel. This gives it a high pixel density of 166. Thanks to its OLED panel, it's super responsive, has a low input lag, and a phenomenal HDR reproduction. Better still, it's color accurate in the sRGB color space, is G-Sync compatible, and has 2 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, making it useful for console gamers. To help prevent burn-in issues, MSI's OLED Care 2.0 has a flurry of functions, and there's even a custom graphene heatsink housed within. A 3-year burn-in warranty also gives you peace of mind. To find out more, watch my detailed review by clicking in the link in the description below or the pinned comments. Now moving back to the Samsung monitor, let's talk about console gaming. And here, as I did mention before, you've got 2 full bandwidth HDMI 2.1 ports, therefore allowing you VRR control and also 4K at 120Hz. Now in terms of how fast the monitor responds, well, it should come as no surprise over here that it does a stonkingly good job. Using the OSRTD tool, I recorded an average initial time of just 0.77 milliseconds with a perfect 100% in window. Therefore, it's really hitting that 120Hz refresh rate window. Equally, when it comes to 60Hz, it sat at just 1.28 milliseconds. Yes, this means that the monitor does respond extremely well even when it comes to console gamers. In terms of the overall motion clarity, it's no surprise that it's degraded from 240Hz, but this is just simply due to the overall refresh rate that you've got. Again, due to the fact that you have got a QD-OLED panel, it means that you've got no sort of inverse ghosting or negative sort of visual experience while running the lower refresh rate ranges. So the gaming section out of the way, let's talk about the overall image quality. And here, as a reminder, you have got a flat 31.5-inch matte-coated QD-OLED panel that has a resolution of 4K. This gives it a pretty good pixel density, but of course in comparison to slightly smaller monitors at 4K, it doesn't quite compare. Now nonetheless over here, in terms of the overall window scaling, I just actually found it pretty good. And in terms of overall text clarity, which I'll be touching upon further down, it was actually also pretty good as well. I had no problems whatsoever when it came to productivity. Now in terms of the overall reflection, it is actually kept down to a minimum. Thanks to that matte coating that you have got, it means that in comparison to the vast majority of other OLEDs out there, be it WOLED or QD-OLEDs with their semi-gloss or glossy panels, this one actually does deal with reflections very well. I had no problems whatsoever in a very bright sunlit room, and even when I had a light pointing directly to the monitor, it didn't throw me off in the slightest. I didn't see my reflection, for example. Again, this does have its disadvantages, as I did point out before in the HDR section, but when it comes to actually looking at the monitor, well, it's actually pretty good. There is also no visible grain that I was able to notice, which is something that plagues certain WOLEDs out there on the market. Now in terms of the overall color accuracy, it does get a little bit convoluted, and in fact I want to run you through this kind of in real time to show how much of a faff it is to get the right sort of color mode. Now I went for the sRGB mode, which isn't exactly labeled via the monitor's OSD. So first I have to press the little button at the top left-hand side of the remote. I go on to the settings. Then from here I go on to all settings. I then go on to picture, expert settings, and then I scroll down. So I've left the brightness at 50, the contrast at 50. Of course, the brightness does very much depend on how bright you want the monitor. I've left the contrast enhancer off, the color tone at warm 1, although natural is also another alternative that you might want to use. The gamma at 2.2, whereas normally it comes with BT 1886, so therefore you'll probably want to adjust this specifically if you're using it with a PC. The white balance, I've left it untouched, and as for the color space, I have hit on the auto mode. Now you might be able to see right now I'm on the native mode, and that's because it really brings out the wider color gamut of this monitor. But the sRGB mode per se is the auto mode, and yes, why didn't they just name it sRGB or have a dedicated sRGB mode for PC users? No idea. Again, I don't know what Samsung are thinking over here. Elsewhere, there's pretty much nothing else that you really have to worry about, such as, let's say, the eye care and the adaptive picture modes. And yes, you'll have to press back a multitude of times in order to get to the regular monitor. Now, with all of that in mind, and with the auto mode selected in terms of sRGB, I put it through its paces. And via my calibrators, I noticed a gamut coverage of 98.7% and a gamut volume of 103.3%. You can see below how it compares to the sRGB standard itself. The average LTE sits at 1.55 with a maximum of 3.38. So yes, it can be used for some serious image editing work or video grading, although you'll be able to see from the graph above that it slightly tails off in terms of the black levels. I'm not really sure if that was to do with the calibrator or the certain settings of the monitor, but nonetheless, it is still pretty color accurate. The tested contrast ratio sat at infinity to 1, with a measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target at 6467 Kelvin at 100%. So yes, pretty much bang on. As for the gamma curve, it is slightly below the 2.2 standard. So what about when it comes to the overall brightness? Well, here in terms of HDR, I clocked in a peak of 954 nits, and this was with the tone mapping set to active. If I were to go on the static mode, it dropped down to 391 nits, which is still pretty bright. Now in SDR, however, it gets up to 235 nits, so therefore not as bright as some of the other OLEDs out there. As a result, I pretty much had to run it at roughly 90 to 100% brightness in a bright sunlit room. As for its minimum brightness, however, it does get all the way down to 12 nits, therefore showing good range. And this means that the monitor can be used in a very dark scenario and is among one of the dimmest monitors I've actually ever come across. Now, another thing that goes hand in hand with the overall brightness is the overall panel uniformity. And yes, indeed, here on my tested panel, it actually did pretty well. Of course, this is somewhat panel lottery, but nonetheless, I can only report what I'm actually testing. As for the overall backlight bleed, well, it's non-existent thanks to the fact that you've got that OLED panel technology, and therefore means it can switch off all the different pixels. Now, aside from all of this, there are certain considerations that you should have, and by that I mean in terms of the overall OLED panel technology itself in comparison to a regular LCD, in other words, an IPS, a VA, and a TM. Now, first off, we have to talk about the OLED burn-in effect, which is something that plagues every single OLED out there, including this Samsung monitor. Now, first off, it is worth pointing out that it's a little bit odd that Samsung have provided you a 2-year warranty within the UK, while in the US and certain other territories, you've got a 3-year burn-in policy. This was actually pointed out by my friend Simon at TFT Central, and I really wish that Samsung would address this, in other words, giving you a 3-year warranty across the board, no matter which region you're from. So worth checking out the actual details and the fine print before getting this monitor to make sure that you're getting potentially the full 3 years, or indeed that you're aware that it might be only going up to 2 years. Now, elsewhere, you have also got ways of mitigating the burn-in effect by certain technologies that are built in. And here, Samsung have provided you a screensaver function, logo and taskbar detection, where it actually can be adjusted via the monitor's OSD, where you can indeed enable or disable it, thermal modulation system, and also a dynamic cooling system, which is built in. Now, it's slightly odd that in comparison to the vast majority of its competitors, you have not actually got the means of enabling and disabling all the different features. Indeed, over here, you've only got the logo protection that you can adjust, and that's about it. There's also a pixel refresh, which you can indeed enable manually, or it will be done automatically. For those people who are not aware, a pixel refresh will be having to be done every so often in order to kind of refresh the pixels to make sure that you're not getting any sort of image retention, and therefore means that something that has to be done every so often, normally after a cycle of 4 hours, or indeed definitely done in terms of forcefully after 16 hours of cumulative usage. This thankfully can be done when the monitor goes in standby, so you don't really have any sort of downtime. But again, just something I thought I should highlight. Elsewhere, you've also got the fringing effect that is due to the sub-pixel layout that you have got of OLED monitors, and therefore means that you've got slightly different odd-looking text. Now, thankfully, QD-OLED panels have actually been really impressive across the board, from the first generation ones to these ones, especially when it comes to the overall resolution, as it seems to mitigate the overall fringing effect because you have got a high resolution, therefore it's a little bit hard to notice. And I can safely say that with this Samsung monitor, it was very hard to notice the fringing effect, and therefore meant that when it came to the overall text legibility and the overall clarity, especially when comparing it to other QD or WOLED panels and including a regular LCD panel, well, it actually did a pretty good job. Moving on, we get on to its overall build quality, and here it's nice to see that you've got a 4-side borderless design. And yes, that means a 31.5-inch form factor doesn't actually take as much space as you might think on your desk. It's also nice to see that you've got a fully ergonomic stand with height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments. It's actually very sturdy, and it's also made out of metal, which also gives it a little bit of extra class. You can of course replace the built-in stand with a VESA compatible stand, allowing you to mount it on a multi-monitor setup or a monitor arm. Now, the back of the monitor, you will have noticed an all-silver finish, and yes indeed it certainly oozes class, namely in comparison to the vast majority of its competitors. There's also a somewhat redundant RGB ring because it's not exactly bright enough to be lighting up a wall, so therefore you might want to disable it via the monitor's OSD. Speaking of which, to access it, there's a small little joystick button that's found next to the inputs, and therefore it makes it a little bit inconvenient. Thankfully, Samsung have thought about it and have also bundled a wireless remote, which is actually sleek and stylish, and also can be recharged via the built-in battery pack that it has, via the USB Type-C port, and also the small little solar panel that's found at the back of it. Therefore meaning that it's very similar to what you'll find on Samsung's modern televisions. Now, this does actually bring me on to one thing that's actually really missing on the remote itself, and that is an input switch. Indeed, for you to switch the inputs, you'll have to access the quick menu or the gaming hub itself and then switch the inputs, which I do think is quite cumbersome. Now, the gaming hub itself is powered by AI and therefore means that certain apps will be upscaled at 4K, which is certainly appreciated, and although it's only available in certain sort of instances, is actually a very comprehensive set of software, probably one of the most comprehensive softwares I've ever come across on a monitor. With that said, I do think it's a step too far, because it's very similar to what you'll find on a TV. And yes, you've even got built-in streaming apps, and you might be wondering, how on earth do I access them? Because they're not part of the PC, but rather the monitor. And this is because the monitor itself has not only got built-in Bluetooth, but also built-in Wi-Fi. So you can connect up to your local network and then stream some of these apps. So it's kind of a multimedia sort of monitor, which also has got 2 built-in 10-watt speakers, which do a decent job across the sound frequency range, but of course are not going to compete with a set of headphones or indeed a set of bookshelf speakers. Now, in terms of the gaming hub itself, it is actually quite convoluted. To access certain settings, you'll have to go into a menu, sub-menu, sub-sub-sub-menu, and this does drive my head in. Because if you do look at some of its competitors and indeed look at just general other monitors, they're very easy to access certain settings. Instead, over here, if you do want to access them, you'll actually have to stop what you're doing on your PC in order to access these settings via the gaming hub. And also, if you're adjusting certain settings, you're always going to get a pop-up about energy saving. So I just wish there was a way of actually disabling this, or indeed remembering the last used modes, and therefore meaning stop bothering me every single time I'm going to, let's say, change the HDR setting, and means I don't have to press yes or no when it comes to energy consumption. Now, what I'm trying to convey over here is that while the gaming hub is really comprehensive, it's very much appreciated that you've got built-in streaming apps, but when it comes to actually usability and practicality, especially if you compare and contrast it with other monitors out there, it's an absolute nightmare. Now, to conclude, I would just like to point out that you've got 2 USB Type-A ports, therefore allowing you to plug in your peripherals. Useful, for example, if you want to access some of the gaming hub apps, or indeed if you just want to have a mouse and keyboard directly plugged in to the monitor, and therefore means you can also use it with your desktop computer as long as you have the USB Type-B to Type-A cable also connected. Although it's worth bearing in mind over here that you do not have a built-in KVM switch, so therefore when it comes to productivity, it doesn't quite compete with some of its competitors. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of the Samsung Odyssey OLED G8 or G80SD. And in a nutshell, it's a pretty impressive monitor that is kind of unique, and that's namely just due to its coating. It's also pretty competitively priced and somewhat one-ups its competitors in terms of the overall feature set. However, it's hard to outright recommend this monitor because I do think that matte coating might throw off certain individuals. At least if you've got a slight bit of a better setup, then you might actually want to go with some of the competitors, because here when it comes to the overall HDR reproduction or even in terms of the SDR reproduction, I think you'll find it to be a little bit better. Elsewhere, when it comes to that convoluted and ridiculous menu system, it's really off-putting. I know this is kind of like people who are coming from a TV and then going to a monitor might appreciate the somewhat familiarity of it, but in all honesty, I do think it's an absolutely mind-boggling experience, and one that truly throws me off, both in terms of the words that I'm trying to convey over here to my overall experience of having reviewed over 270 different PC monitors. Now don't get me wrong, this monitor is not bad, and it's actually pretty impressive across the board, namely when it comes to its input lag, its response time, the fact that you have got a pretty color accurate panel, and also that you've got a really nice stylish design and that 4K resolution at 240Hz. But I just think that there are some other monitors out there that you might seriously want to consider, and some of which I've reviewed will be down in the description below for your own consideration. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of this monitor down in the comment section below, and how you feel it compares to some of its key competitors. Now, if you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing, and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I hope to see you next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.